So welcome back. This month we're joined by Rupa, who you might have seen on previous podcasts before.
Hiya.
And we're also joined by Ian, Mr.
Morning.
Folks, as we know him. Do you want to just give us a bit of background about yourself?
Sure. I know these guys because I had the pleasure of teaching English to Jonathan for a couple of years at GCSE. Prajay was at school with Jonathan and my own son. And so I've known them since they were quite small. I started off as an investment banker when I left school myself. I left with my A-levels and worked in the city in financial markets for about 20 years. Decided I wanted to change. So I did my first degree and my master's degree with the Open University as a mature student. So my educational experience is slightly different, certainly to yours. And then I've spent the last 20 years teaching and then tutoring, mostly in private schools in Northeast London. And my tutoring company, I've been dealing with children almost exclusively from year 7 to year 13, but working on occasions with degree students as well for the last 10 years or so.
In English.
Sorry, yes, in English and English literature. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. However, I should say that as my students moved off to university and they came back to me for advice, then what they came back for was not I had no subject-specific skills, but they were still very much in need of
Life
understanding
coaching.
Critical thinking, life coaching, how to manage your studies, because it's
just something we're quite big on here as well.
Well, having been a student myself as an adult and holding down a job and being a father and the rest of it, it's easy to underestimate just exactly how much pressure there is, because your day as a university student looks quite empty, but it really isn't. There's a lot of pressure, and of course everybody leaves everything to the last minute, and we have to constantly learn. We have to constantly build up our skills. So that's why a lot of the students I've tutored lower down the school, I've ended up tutoring at university, which has been very fulfilling.
Yeah, and your background, if you don't know already.
If you guys don't know already, my background is sort of similar to Ian's, but it took a different route. 25 odd years in the city, did teacher training, had issues, personal issues, so couldn't finish it, decided to start a tutoring company, which is where we are now, and then have gone off to do other things. So currently I'm working on my other business, which is a children's nursery. Had several challenges there over the last couple of years, so just got through all of that. And currently I'm looking at commercial property conversions. So lots of different things.
Everything.
As you can see. It's definitely not shiny penny syndrome. It is just time to move on. So going off to do other things. So this is why I'm not sort of involved with tuition anymore, because I think I've done my time in that. Time to pass it on and move on.
So we're talking about VAT.
Specifically, specifically VAT and whether it should be added on to private school fees or not. So I know you guys have some thoughts on this.
Well, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it before we sort of launch, because you won't get a word in edgeways once we start.
I mean, it's kind of 50-50 for me.
I must admit, there is a bit of me that thinks, yes, maybe they should. And
well, especially if you guys have gone through paying for that. Like, imagine if it was 20% more.
Well,
we wouldn't have been able to afford
exactly.
it.
But then they're a business. They're still a business. So they're a charity, but they're a business.
They classify themselves as a charity.
I think that's the place to start. I think what's important is that we have laws in this country that set out how taxation works.
Yes.
And it's very obvious and it's completely understandable that charities do not pay taxation, because the money that is given to charities, there is a tax break. You can gift aid your charity, but all benefit should go. If you're going to give £1 to a charity, then £1 should go to benefit whatever charity you've chosen. I think that there is a debate about how this will impact fee-paying parents and how it will impact the school system. But I think we have to start with the idea is it not fair that these huge businesses, and that's what they are, is it not fair that they pay a similar tax levy overall to any other business?
But you could argue the count. Now I'm going to play devil's advocate here. The other argument of that is the majority of charities, when you look at them, not every pound they're run as businesses. So if you look at the likes, the big ones, you know, that need to put that admin in, etc. I think only 50% or 40%, it's a very low number that actually then makes it.
I don't disagree, but what we're saying is that the charity is set up to be a charity, to do good works. The argument that I've come across, and that, my wife has been a business manager at a large private school for many years. There is this discussion of, can we provide public benefit? Are we providing public benefit as a private school? And I think it's difficult to argue, particularly from my own experience of the schools that I've worked at, that you are providing a public benefit. So sure, let's take Oxfam, for example. I don't know the figures, but if you give £5 to Oxfam, maybe only £3.50 finds its way into good works. But you need an administration to run a charity of that size.
Of course you do.
It would be
Of course you
ridiculous
do.
to think that everything's going to be for free, but that's distinctly different from saying that almost nothing of your penny goes to public benefit or charitable good. And I think it's a little bit disingenuous on the front of schools to suggest that they are providing public benefit to the point that allows them to justify themselves as charities. I find that problematic.
Yes.
So in a sense, there's a failure of the social contract.
Oh, hello. Somebody taught you well. Yes, I think there is. My issue is that do we not run the risk of allowing wealth, that there's no other way to look at it, wealth to define whether or not you can benefit from a tax break? Now, I know that sounds a bit silly because, of course, if you're wealthier, you can benefit from a tax break. But this is not sort of a loophole that you've found in an investment fund. What we're saying is we're allowing these businesses to have different terms of trade to other businesses. And I'm not talking about state schools. I'm just saying if they are businesses, then they should be taxed appropriately. If they are charities, then they should be doing an awful lot more than we're currently seeing.
Because the whole thing with this is it's not just the VAT that they're talking about, independent schools losing their business rates relief as well. So in that sense, yes, I completely agree with you that you can't have it both ways.
No, once you pull at this thread, VAT will be just the start of this. I mean, if we're going to go down this route as a society, then I think we have to have an honest debate about why these schools became so important in the first place.
Yes, absolutely.
To a large extent, to parents who really can't afford that sort of financial commitment, and that has had a huge impact on other aspects of family life.
And you've seen that while you were teaching in the school, and I've been through it. I think in all the time that the children were at school, I think we had one holiday, and that was a long weekend in Disneyland Paris.
How middle class is that, by the by?
It was Disneyland Paris because my husband couldn't fly, so we had to go Eurostar, and we wanted to take the children abroad.
I've had experience of teaching children whose parents are paying the school fees from a trust fund. I've had experience of grandparents paying the school fees for any number of grandchildren. There are obviously very wealthy families. I've also had experience of a family where both mother and father were black cab drivers. They owned their cab. Dad drove it at night, mum drove it all day. And that was the only way they could raise the money to pay the school fees.
Yeah.
And so there are huge sacrifices being made. Is that the right thing to do? And I'm not suggesting we should price these people out of private education in order to teach them a lesson about, how they live their lives or make financial plans. But I do think it's important that people understand that there are other ways in which you can achieve a good educational outcome without the need to spend eye-watering amounts of money.
It is a huge amount of money. I think we worked out that we could have bought houses in cash for both our children for the amount of money that we paid. Because absolutely. So, it isn't just about the fees. You've got all the additional stuff on top.
Mm-hmm.
The uniforms were an eye-watering amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got more than one child. My God, you're crippled. You've got the holidays, you've got all the extracurricular stuff. But, you know, there's a pro side to that as well. And I think that a lot of parents don't. So there's two things here. There is a mindset that says, particularly in Asian cultures, that says, my school is not going to go, my child is not going to go to the local state school because we want better. And so that simply paying for it is perceived as better.
Also, the good state schools, they do tend to be in areas which are more affluent.
And more middle class.
And so I think no matter what, you still win a sort of postcode lottery, as it were.
And all that will happen is that the schools that have the spaces are generally the schools that are not as well performing in the state sector. All that will happen is that the more achieving schools will become oversubscribed, if they're more oversubscribed.
I think sort of bring this back to the notion of why we pay for education. Because if we look at this topic, we're talking about government plans to raise the price of private education beyond the means of many people. You could argue, or at least I would argue, that for some people, that idea of paying for it is better has become almost a mantra, and it's not healthy. So if you look at the true cost of sending a child to school, as you asked, it is crippling, and you would not spend that money on any other part of your life without having a huge amount of research done.
Yes, absolutely.
You're talking about buying a house. If you've got two children in private school, you're talking about buying a decent-sized second property. You wouldn't buy a decent-sized second property without really knowing what you're buying. Now, my concern is that there is this general assumption that if you send your child to a private school, they will be better educated, they'll meet interesting people, they may well have better life opportunities. It's possible. It's highly unlikely for the majority of private schools that I have had experience of, because we're not talking about going to Eton and Harrow. That's a separate issue. Now, with the local schools that we're dealing with in this area, and there are some very good, very large, very academically achieving schools. If you're fortunate enough, and I was, to have two sons who are musicians, or your sons are great sports people, or they have some other background that would not get properly serviced in the state system, then great. And the schools will do their best to try and get students like that into the classroom. However, the idea that just because you send your perfectly intelligent, decent son or daughter to a private school, which in some way elevate them beyond what they could achieve anyway, I think is incorrect. And I think you're paying way, way, way too much money when you could apply that in a better sense. So let's just suggest that you have managed to find amongst the family the resources and a pot of money to put your child through secondary education in a private school. If there's going to be no other benefit from being at that private school, no soft benefit, no extracurricular benefit, then it may well be better to ask yourself how you could change that child's life with that pot of money. So if you were to, and I know this is a bit delicate because we all run tutoring businesses here, if you were to find a good state school, even if it meant moving to a different postcode, and then identify some tutors who would help support your children through their aspects of their education that aren't working so well. For some, it's science, maths, and education. For some, it's and English. Some it's just English. Then the rest of the money that you would have spent on their education, if it's still free money, it's available for the family. Now, invested, this is where my investment banking background is helpful, invested wisely over the we're talking about 7 or 8 year period, with the growth that you could achieve, invested in a fairly safe, investment fund, would allow you to then send your child to university debt-free. Now, that is going to make a material difference to a child's life. not having to pay off student loans over long periods of time. In actual fact, if we talk about the numbers we're talking about for private schooling today, by my simple calculations, you could send your child to university, pay for their tuition, pay for their accommodation, their maintenance, and you'd still have enough left over to possibly give them a deposit for a flat
Yes,
when they left.
I agree. I did the sums.
If you've got no student debt and you've got the ability to buy a flat in your early 20s, that's going to materially change your life. Sitting behind somebody who ended up working at Goldman Sachs or for the government in maths in year 7 isn't. It just isn't. Not in the same way. So I think what I would urge parents to do, this comes back to the idea about taxation, it's not just that it will price them out. Are they already spending money that could be more wisely used?
Yes.
That would be my question.
The problem with that is for most people, certainly it was for me, it's a very big emotional trip to actually say, well, particularly if your child's already in that private school system, to then pull them out and put them into a state school system, there's this, and it's more on the parents than the child.
It is a leap of faith, but
it's more than a leap of faith. It's this, certainly for me, it would have been, well, I failed my child.
Well, not if you are more engaged, because I think sometimes when we talk about parents using private education, they are purchasing something that they can't really value or easily quantify whether it's the right way to spend their money. So it may be better to use, if you're not going to use private education, it will give you the chance to engage a little bit more with that process. So you'll know if your child's being tutored by someone like me. I mean, I've been working for families and I'm on the 4th or 5th child, and I've known families for 10, 15 years. They know me, I know them, and they know what they're getting when their child has a lesson with me.
Yes.
Now, if you send your child to a private school, it is unfortunately not the case, as it is in every school, state, grammar or private. You cannot guarantee that your child is going to be sitting in a classroom with the best available teacher, the best available resources.
We've all, you guys probably have as well, we've all had experiences of parents coming to us.
Yeah, and it's not because that schools are cutting corners or schools don't care. It's the fact that it is very, very hit and miss.
Yeah.
So if you're in a really good school, but you're a little bit unfortunate and you have an excellent teacher in a particular subject and they for some reason they have to take a term or two off, you have supply teachers because there isn't a huge pool of highly talented, dedicated teachers who, we know this is a long-term problem, who want to work in any part of the industry.
So one of the arguments that Labour is putting forward currently is what putting VAT on the independent school system will do is allow the government to train up more teachers.
Well, you see, now
that's one of their arguments.
Having been a teacher and a tutor, and having had a professional job that was, incredibly demanding, I don't like it when people go quickly to the assumption that just because a teacher gets lots of holidays a year and they get fairly well paid, that it's in some way
it's hard work.
It's incredibly hard work, and I know that it can be popular amongst people to give teachers a hard time because of that. But equally, it has to be said that, and I can speak from personal experience, but I think anecdotally it's something that we bump into a lot. There are quite a lot of people who end up in teaching because they've got very few other options.
Yes.
And that is
seen that.
We've all seen that. And I think anybody who's been to school ever must have had a teacher who you think you'd rather be an actor or you'd rather be playing football or you'd rather be doing, and that's absolutely fine. None of us have to be 100% committed to what we're doing. But I think for me, the idea that you're going to necessarily have a better outcome because you're sending your child to private school is just not true. And if you were more engaged and understood how your child was being educated or what was going on, then I think it would make a difference. So the argument I've often used is the idea of a Prada handbag. I quite often have, when I meet a parent, mum will be carrying a very expensive Prada handbag and they'll be moaning about the expense of school fees and then the extra expense of tuition. And I've always put out, I've got a shop carrier bag in my cupboard.
Yeah.
Could I replace my shop carrier bag with your Prada handbag because it does the same job?
Yeah.
And of course, never. No one's going to want to take a plastic bag over. But I said, that's really the decision you're making.
Even if it's Waitrose.
Even if it's Waitrose. But that's the decision you're making here, because what you're basically saying is, I need a bag. Any bag probably would work for me, but I'd rather carry this one.
Yes.
I think like the magic of is like actually one of the things that gets, so for instance, if a student goes off to Harvard or something like that, is it or
Stanford,
Cambridge,
like our current Prime
yeah.
Minister.
Is it because they've gone to a great elite school, or is it because they've already got that ability? They would have thrived anyway.
Funny you should say that. I was just reminding myself of some stats today. Just had a quick cursory glance, and I got told off for having it on the back of an envelope, hence the notebook. There have been, in recent years, only 5 prime ministers who did not go to private school. But funnily, they almost all of them, apart from John Major, I think, went to grammar schools.
Apparently John Major was like the cleverest person.
But the interesting thing was they all went on to Oxbridge. Yeah. All of them.
Okay, so we've had some very serious political changes to the way we do things in this country, and we are, and I think it's a very good thing, sending an enormous amount of young people to university each year. No argument with that. I would question whether we should be sending all of those young people to university. They should continue their education. Now, the reason I mention that is because when I left school at 18 with my A-levels and went to work in the city, very few of my sixth form colleagues went on to university. And university was very much seen as a place where you go to join the professions. That was the thing. You could not take, in 1981, when my colleagues were going off to university, you could not take the sort of degrees that you could take now.
But you had the two-stream system, didn't you? You had the polytechnics.
They had polytechnics, and also, and to be fair, although it was the early 80s, things weren't great, there were jobs available and there were career paths available that would allow you to progress and to get a formal education, a professional education, which didn't need you to go to university. And of course, everyone went for free. No one was piling up debt. Now, the reason I mentioned that is because I saw some research a few years ago that, and I'm struggling here because I can't remember the exact numbers, but the bottom line was that they did a study of students from state school backgrounds across the country and private school backgrounds across the country. They took the same A-levels and they had the same A-level grades. They followed them through university. And it was 100% correlation that the state school students outperformed the private school students at university.
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, this comes back to what you were saying about the Prime Minister. So it's all very well and good to say we had these senior members of society that did not go to private school. But it's the soft benefits of having a family that is not struggling financially, that can give you
that's it.
The space. So with the university studies, because when they got to university, the state school students weren't shocked that they were asked to get on with it, to read, to study, to work independently. Unfortunately, and this I speak from experience here, that the private school system,
they weren't cushioned.
Well, they're incredibly cushioned in their day-to-day lives. But
I meant the state.
The private school kids are. But outside of that, the reality is that how does a private school sell itself? It says 86.5% A star to A at A level, 93% A star to A at GCSE, 7 to 9 at GCSE. I'm showing my age there. I know it's changed. So what happens is that tuition in state schools sometimes lacks the breadth that you would expect. And because students are being funneled and channeled towards those outcomes, pass the exam, get the best possible grade, that they don't always develop the broader skills that somebody who is struggling in a busy school and then going home and having to share a bedroom with a sibling or 2 or 3, not having a laptop, not necessarily having all the other electronic benefits, and not having a library of books in the house, not having mum and dad who can pitch in with a bit of homework. These students, the intelligence levels could be similar, but they learn to work and they learn to be more self-reliant. And I think that sometimes the private education system can take away that understanding that you need to engage. You can take a bright child and you can hothouse them to get the grade you want as a school. That doesn't mean you've educated them.
Yeah, so with independent schools, my experience has been, and to an extent from where I've talked to people whose children have gone to state schools, and I've got friends whose children have gone to state schools, it happens less in state schools from what I can see, and again, it's anecdotal. But with independent schools, it was very much, well, you can't take that particular A level because you're never going to achieve the grade, as you're saying, right? Which is why they achieve the grades they achieve. And there's not a huge amount of difference. One of the stats that I looked at that they were talking about, at A level, they looked at the top 300 independent schools and the top 300 state schools. The independent school children achieved 3 A's across the board. And maybe that's part of the filtering system. Whereas with the state schools, it was AAB. So, to then go on to university, you're already disadvantaged because when they do, as when they do personal statements, it isn't just about these are the grades you've got. It's what else have you done? I mean, the amount of stuff my daughter did to get to where she is, it was literally like ticking box. Okay, well, have I done pro bono work? Have I done this? Have I done that? Okay, I've met all of my criteria. Now I can apply. So, it's a much broader discussion, I think. And you're talking about tuition. I agree with you that actually you need to look at what you get the best bang for your buck.
Absolutely. As you would in any other aspect of life.
Exactly.
Education has got this weird kind of ring fence.
Because it's so emotional.
In terms of parents. I understand that. And there is, but I think like many things in our public debate, to sort of come back to this idea about the taxation, we are too quick to look for a headline that suits our position.
Confirmation bias.
Absolutely. And I think this idea that private is always better over state is incorrect. It can be.
But vice versa.
Yeah, and absolutely. But equally, the idea that the government should not be looking to tax these businesses, I'm going to call them businesses, in the way that they're suggesting, but obviously the Labour government, the Labour Party, if they were in the election, are suggesting. I think to knee-jerk to that being, it will be wrong for too much pressure on the state system, unfair on middle class. It's not that simple. There are other options, other ways of looking at this. And I just want to keep coming back to the cash. We live in a very difficult time for young people. And I would just really want parents to look very, very carefully. And this may be an opportunity for parents to reflect on how they spend their money. So maybe if it's a case of, well, we can afford X, but X plus 20% is going to be a stretch. It might mean, all sorts of other. Then great. Then look at that and say, should we be spending X then?
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
I think I'm not suggesting that the political debate is intended to do that. I'm suggesting it's providing the opportunity to do that for parents to just look again. Because I think it's not fair that parents are so. It's almost impossible. It's a bit of a closed system. It's any parent who sees this will probably recognise the idea, because I certainly do, and I was a teacher and a parent, of going to school, particularly if you're at a private school, ask a question, criticise, or make any comment about why a particular educational path has been followed. Why aren't we doing more widespread reading in Key Stage 3? Why are we, studying GCSE texts in Key Stage 3? Well, the main answer for that is because we've got a scheme of work and it's easier, usually. But the point is, if you look at the examples, they're all saying the same thing. Wide reading, in my subject area, wide reading at Key Stage 3, it doesn't take place.
No,
Certainly not
it doesn't.
and therefore you're not teaching your children in years 7, 8 and 9 to read. But if you were to go along as a parent, particularly if you go along as a teacher, that doesn't help at all, and ask them why they are studying a GCSE text as a classroom reader in year 8 or year 7, you'll just get this stonewall of, well, we know what we're doing. That it's not fair on parents, because you can't go along and say to your car dealer, I'd like to buy this £100,000 car, but can you explain to me why he's got only one seat in the front? Well, no, we know what we're doing. You would want to know everything there is to know about that investment, whatever that asset was, before you bought it.
There's the idea of this parents just sort of think, or a lot of parents just think, I'm paying money for this, therefore
Must be good.
it's exactly what I need. Like, they've got it all covered. It's outsourcing the responsibility
And it's horrifying to think that you might have spent all that money and not got what you want, what you thought you were getting. That's the really horrifying thing. I mean, some of the most intelligent people I've ever met went to private school and to Oxbridge. Some of the, shall we say, less intelligent people I've ever met
also went to
private school and to Oxbridge. And there is not this, so coming back to my wicked past as an investment banker, one of my colleagues was running an graduate training program. So you have this idea that you've gone to a really good private school, you've got 3 A's at A level, 3 A stars at A level, you've gone off to a Russell Group university and you've got a first or a 2-1. To get onto the graduate training program of the particular bank where he worked, and this is about 10 years ago, it's probably worse now. He had 3,500 applicants for 80 positions globally. So he wanted to possibly interview 230, 240. So how do you go from 3,500 to 240? So we just kept applying filters onto the individuals. We ended up, you take out who hasn't got a first, who hasn't got a master's, who hasn't got an MBA. We ended up with students who had a distinction at MBA from places like the LSE, Oxford and Cambridge, Stanford, Harvard, all the top universities across Europe and in the Far East. And that got him down to about 260. So in order to make the cut for the interview, you had to have an education that was way beyond. You had to have a success level of
the top
education.
1%.
Way beyond. And the truth is that the people you probably wanted to hire, you've already discarded.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But the
it's
point,
not always.
no, it's not the case that just because that achievement is there. But the point,
Sometimes it's worse.
It can be. And the point I'm trying to make is that to sell a parent and a student at the age of 17, 18, and parents are, desperately worried and concerned, trying to do the right thing, to sell them the idea, get a good 3 A-levels from this school, we'll get you to Russell Group University, get yourself a degree, you're set for life. It's not true.
It
And
used
yet-
and yet,
65% of judges are from private education, I think. 60% of private secretaries and top civil service jobs are from private schools and probably Oxbridge. And, the stats just go on and on.
Some of that is to do with closed shops within the industries, because I'd mentioned earlier about the very small percentage of my colleagues who went on to university. University in the 70s and 80s, and obviously for decades, if not centuries before, it was there to educate people that who were going to move into the civil service, into law, into medicine. It was not there for general further education.
No, it never was.
We didn't believe. So those industries you just mentioned, particularly the civil service, and I would argue possibly the armed forces as well.
Yes, I think that was the other
officer class.
stats.
The universities were taking a tiny percentage of young people and saying, you will be our next barristers, lawyers, judges, our next.
Yeah.
I think it depends on what course people take, because nowadays the courses in university,
when I looked at university,
they don't lead to anything.
No, not just that. There is. I've always
Sometimes you're better off just starting work.
Absolutely. This idea that
16.
there's a correlation between a degree in media and a job at the BBC.
No.
It's never been the case. And it's not.
You're more likely if you're 14 and you start editing or something to be. It's portfolio based, isn't it?
I don't know.
You'd be much further ahead.
Yes. And go on, sorry, John.
I do use filters, obviously, when I'm looking to bring people in. And if someone's CV went to UCL, is a sort of studying a medical degree or something like that, I immediately go, maybe.
But there's a reason why you've applied those filters, right? Because you're looking for a science tutor. So this, right, in that case, so the subject knowledge is there. The fact that they have made it to UCL shows that the work ethic is there and the study ethic is there, which is
And that matters.
understandable in our business.
I don't even think it's the main thing. I think the main thing is actually being able to talk to people, deliver a class, communicate well, simplify complex
So going back to
ideas.
the soft
It's
skills.
something I've struggled with a lot over time.
Yeah.
Being able to communicate properly.
Like a good academic record, I think, shows a level of conscientiousness, and that's something that I sort of will look for.
But we're not saying it's the only thing, though.
But I'd say, like,
But
for
that's
me,
one
it's
of your first
if
filters.
if I'm looking at applications and I'm just like I could drown in a sea of data, or I can go, okay, well, I've got to start chopping. Yeah.
I must admit, I've been really surprised to see how many candidates we've had.
Yeah, and then how many I filter out.
And I obviously I don't see the filter stage because I only look at the top
most
level.
of them I just look and then I'll just go, okay, no.
I agree.
And then I have to bring in the best people.
Of course you do.
Before we move too far along, having taught you English at GCSE, I just want to say how impressed I am with the metaphor drowning in a sea of data as well. Excellent. I pat myself on the back slightly there. That's very good. So one of the things I experienced when I first worked in the city was that we didn't hire graduates. I didn't have a degree, and most of the young people I worked with back in the early 80s didn't have degrees. All you had to have was far too much to say for yourself and the ability to shout and scream to trade the financial markets. But as time went on, we looked at hiring graduates for specific roles. So we started off, and I think fairly understandably, with graduates with an economics background. This is the financial markets, and so that seemed to make some sense. Didn't work particularly because financial markets are driven famously by fear and greed, not by economic theory. Okay, and we've all read Fear and Greed. I think everybody put it on your UCAS form, as I remember. And then we said, okay, well, let's have another look at this, maybe mathematics, because we were trading more complicated financial instruments and a mathematical background. Wonderful understanding of how to build an instrument and how to do something clever. Absolutely impractical in terms of trading it in the market. Not entirely, but that didn't really work. So then we started being a bit more creative, and we looked at engineers who would have sort of understanding of structures and the way. Long story short, the best graduates we ever hired were graduates in psychology. Because
That makes perfect sense.
Because the
does make
markets
sense.
are traded by people. They're not traded, algorithms trade the market into a large extent. But at that time, it was much more important to have a sense of how people were feeling, how people were thinking, what the psychology of the markets
That's
were.
why they brought in behavioural economics. And
The reason,
Yes.
the reason I mention this is that, coming back to your point, Prajay, the idea that you can take a degree that will get you a job. We need to debunk that, because well-educated people who can apply themselves, who are intellectually curious, will probably have a better professional outcome.
Yeah.
So what you're suggesting is that we go back to the Wild West, because if you think about how universities were set up, Oxford and Cambridge were set up for the clergy.
Well, no, sorry to interrupt. I agree with that. But what I'm actually saying is that everybody, particularly at a high-performing school, grammar school, private school, these are the most important exams you'll ever take, your GCSEs.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And then you have your GCSEs, and these are the most important. Then these are your A levels.
But
The point is, when you get into the bigger, wider world, the type of degree you've had, the experience you've had, the quality of your degree is going to be much more important than whether you got all 9s at GCSE.
But to be able to get into that degree,
Well, we know that it's not exclusive to private schools. So what I'm saying is, perhaps what might be useful is to look at the pros and cons of these two systems.
yes.
The pros and cons of paying for an education, because what this topic is, are we pricing people out of their education? And I suppose my question would be, is that necessarily a bad thing?
Yeah, and just very quickly on that point, if you think about it, again, devil's advocate, parents paying independent school fees are paying twice already, because they're part of the taxation system, and what, 50% of the money goes to education,
Yeah, so you again,
and then you're paying on top of that.
But you see, that's one of the arguments that I would find that difficult to sort of just let it go, because that is the case. But you're being given the option of how you spend
Yes,
your money. You're not
absolutely.
actually being taxed twice, because you're taxing yourself the second time.
Fine.
My question would be is, have you really thought through the pros and cons of
Yes.
the two systems? And would it not be wiser to take some advice, to think a little bit more about, I know it's emotional and I know you want the very best for your child. We all did that. But right now, even more so than I think in the last 25 years, the best outcome from the child isn't necessarily chucking a huge amount of money at private education.
No.
Yes.
Well, I think most of where I am today and how I think and everything and what I've learned has come way after being even at university. I don't.
But do you not think that in this case, it happens to be an independent school,
Yeah.
but do you not think that your education and all the experiences you had with your music, with all of that,
It's the experiences.
that has led you to where you are? If you think about the best tutors that we've had, I would argue that some of the best tutors we've had have come from a private school background. Look at Gareth, look at Caroline, and that it was a different. I mean, I didn't know they'd come from private school backgrounds.
I didn't know that
It was
as well.
only afterwards, but they happened to be some of our. Look at Ian, some of our best tutors.
I didn't go to private school.
No, you didn't go to private school,
No,
but
I certainly
but
did not
you
go
are
to
very.
private school.
You had to
are
teach
very-
private school
But
kids.
but you teach private school children,
Yes, yeah, I do. Yeah, okay.
so you understand.
I think-
the
I just wanted to
system.
clarify that I
Yeah.
am one of these kids who really didn't have any of
No,
these
I didn't go
benefits.
to private school either.
But I think there's
You all turned out fine. So
but it wasn't so
Possibly, yeah.
it's more about going to a good school rather than, because
There
like
we
I
go.
went from not a very good school to Forest, and it was like a very big difference, like
Massive
a massive
difference.
difference.
So I had a similar thing. I went from the biggest comprehensive in southeast London to a grammar school in Kent, and what a leap!
But I think it's very difficult to take individual cases and suggest that it works for the whole, because I've several of my friends who I went to school with did not have a particularly easy ride through the large comprehensive schools in Walthamstow that I went to. And yes, okay, it turned out okay for me, and it turned out okay for some of my friends, and they went to good universities or got good jobs. And it is possible, but that doesn't mean that of the 1,000 boys who were at my senior high school in Walthamstow, that everybody had exactly the same possibilities or opportunities, because you as I say, so the individual doesn't count for the whole. What
No,
we're talking
of
about
course
here in
not.
terms of how we tax these schools, come back to that idea. If we're talking about how we tax these schools, for me, and I've said it a few times, I'm just going to underline it again, I believe that it is important that parents are almost forced, because I don't think many parents are forced to consider clearly the debate between, is it the case that all state schools are terrible and all private schools are good? Because unfortunately, I believe that is the argument that has
Yes.
been put forward far too simply, far too plainly,
I agree.
and in my view, very incorrectly.
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned pros and cons.
I did indeed.
So I have 3 of each, roughly. So I'm going to read out one at a time, and you just tell me your thoughts.
Mhm.
Yeah? So we start with the pro. We have increased fees at independent schools will discourage middle-class families from applying, which could potentially benefit the state system. Do we agree with that?
I believe that we have to have a representation of society in a classroom. Now, that's difficult to achieve because we don't have a representation of all society in where we live. I mean, we all choose to live in places because we're comfortable there. But for a lot of people, the majority of people, they end up living in places because that's the only option. And so the argument against grammar schools back in when we talked about closing grammar schools was that it would give us a better mix of social and intellectual and financial backgrounds in the classroom. as we know, that society doesn't mix that way. Postcode lottery, I think, was your term. So I'm not necessarily sure that you all of a sudden overnight you'd have these wonderful debates in classrooms up and down the country in state schools.
Okay. Anything to add?
No, I think I very much agree.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go with an against. Introducing VAT on independent schools could make them expensive, potentially driving these families to an already overburdened state system. So it could result in larger classes for state schools.
I mean, look, we have in this country, generalisation, but it's mine, so I'm going to make it. My experience of growing up in a very working class background, growing up and working amongst all sorts of people in different contexts, we need to value education in this country far more highly. And I don't mean we need to spend, parents need to spend their money or send them kids to university or private school. I mean at home, in the day-to-day workplace, we need to understand that it is good to be educated. It's actually cool to learn. And I think that this idea that that it only takes place in the best schools, I think is problematic. You know, I think we need to, and in order to, if we're going to do that, we need to fund education in a far more creative way. We have systematically put various sides of the political agenda. We've systematically underfunded education. We don't value teachers as we should, and we only value education because we think it will get you a good job. Now, I believe that I've said this going back 20 years, we do not necessarily have the best people in our schools.
No, we don't.
One of the reasons for that is I don't think we value education in the way some of our European partners do. So for me, it is fair to say that if we're going to attract better quality teachers, we need to pay more. Now, this might mean for 5, 10, maybe even 15 years, you'll be overpaying teachers who don't actually deserve to be paid in that way. But ultimately, if we don't fund our teaching staff at a higher level, we won't attract higher quality. We'll make it harder in the classroom. Now, it's not that simplistic. That's not going to change education overnight. But I think extra funding for teaching staff, extra funding for schools is vital. That will make a huge
absolutely.
difference.
So to sum that up, I think, and we've talked about this over the years. We need to level up the state system rather than bring down the systems that the peripheral systems like the independent
just
school
to put
system.
some numbers on it, remember 7% of us young people go to private school.
Yeah,
so that means that, we're talking about 7% of our pupils. 93% are really where we should be considering what's going on there.
Exactly, and level that up rather than focus on the 7%, of which out of that 93%, only I think it's 5% that go to grammar school. So maybe look at how you can improve the state system.
So, this leads me on to this. So we said it could raise 1.5 billion annually, adding VAT.
Mm-hmm.
Now, firstly, do you think that's going to? Do you think that money would go to state schools?
Well, I think
would it get put in people's pockets? Would it?
Firstly, I think it's unlikely to raise 1.5 billion because that's probably on existing numbers. If you take the impact of 20% increase in fees and the reduction in number of
That's
students,
exactly it. They haven't
you'll
done
probably end
that.
up with less than 1.5
A lot
billion.
less than that.
1.5 billion a year sounds like an awful lot of money in terms of funding education. It's nowhere near enough. I would have
It's a
thought.
really, really tiny amount compared to Crossrail.
And as soon as another project comes up, or another chancellor comes in, or another political party, education, of course, because it's state-run and state-funded, it's incredibly political. And no, it's not fair to say that money will be ring-fenced and go into education. And then who's to say whether let's say you've got £1 billion pot and it is ring-fenced and everybody knows nobody can touch it. How do you start spending it? The northeastern schools, northwestern schools, the southwest,
I would
where there's a lot.
I know how I would spend it. I would definitely level up the northeast. Not the northeast, northern England.
But then the southwest would then be screaming quite rightly, well, what about us?
I would start with the north because the differentials.
Just don't go to Cornwall on holiday is my suggestion.
Because of the differentials in the results that they achieve.
Inner city parts of London, Inner city parts of Manchester.
I mean, I've
Leicestershire,
taught very
Birmingham.
briefly in inner city London, and it needs a whole load more than that pin drop of a bit of money.
I think the argument is fair. If they ring fence it, then extra money for schools is always welcome. It's probably not going to be enough.
No, it definitely wouldn't be enough.
Right. So we'll go back to against, like a con.
Even fixing the potholes in England would cost 15 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
The scholarship and bursary situation. Now, if these schools had to add VAT and charge more, it would reduce the number of scholarship and bursary places available.
I mean, they
which is
don't really
even less
do.
opportunity for less affluent
There are
people.
some schools that do a lot of outreach work, but there aren't that many. So for example, local schools, the local independent schools here, how many bursaries do they provide?
not many. Well,
One or two?
they're doing more bursaries now.
They're probably
but then
doing
in
more now.
scholarships, there's like a lot less.
To make a difference to a child who would benefit from that, but comes from a very deprived background, you need 100% school. You need to pay for everything. And if you hand out bursaries, they are usually small amounts of money.
They are.
Parents still have got to find the extra money, And I've used them before. It is eye-watering, and more importantly, spending that money in that way is life-changing.
Yeah.
And I believe that there are better changes you could make to a
Yes.
young person's life. That's coming back to
So I think it's a moot point, really.
There's some people who get 100% scholarships.
They
And
are very
yeah.
rare.
But-
Very rare.
But I'm like, in a lot of cases, I think sometimes the parents aren't necessarily that poor.
Yes. Yes, certainly. So in my daughter's year, if I look at the children that got scholarships, whether they were 100% or not, they definitely weren't poor. Scholarship is more ability based, whereas bursary is more means based. And I think maybe if they switch that, then it may make a difference.
For me, that's not necessarily an educational debate as much as a
political.
political one,
Yeah.
and one for everybody to consider. I think I don't think it's fair that any business should receive. I don't think it's fair that any individual should receive an unfair tax advantage in that way. We can have any society, I believe, that we're willing to pay for, and if we're not willing and to pay through taxation, and let's be fair, we all hate the fact that Google and Starbucks and these people don't pay the proper taxes they should get. But if you said to any individual, would you like some advice on how to reduce your tax bill?
Of course we'd take it.
100%, yes, everybody's going to say that.
Yeah.
So if we're not going to be comfortable with higher levels of tax, because we've never had such high levels of taxation.
It's
since the war.
ridiculous.
This is outrageous. So it's not about necessarily the overall level of taxation. It's what we do with that money and how we spend it.
We are a business. We are an educational business.
And we pay VAT.
And we have to pay VAT as well as
Every other
taxes.
tax.
Yeah.
And I don't understand the point of VAT. Maybe I'm being naive
No,
here.
we've always said this.
You're
It's a stupid
already
tax.
taxed on your income. Why then tax again?
I think was it so consumption taxes, they made sense maybe when they were brought in because we are in a growing economy. So and it makes sense that if people are consuming a lot, then
But you've already been taxed on that income that you're spending.
yeah.
So why
but-
are you being taxed again?
Well, it's just a way for the government to get money. It's as in if
So
you,
there's no actual
Yeah.
short of we need this money
Yeah.
and we're going to take it. There's no actual.
But then when you study VAT, I did study it a little bit. So just like how you create fairer tax systems. Consumption taxes tend to hit the poor and the middle class quite hard, and then rich people, wealthy people, certainly not that much.
Well, they're
Because-
regressive taxes. This is the thing. It is a
Yes.
regressive tax. So it's not, everybody pays the same rate irrespective of income. Sales tax, purchase tax, they've been a part of the taxation system of Western democracies and economic systems for a very, very long time.
Yes, they have.
I think, if if we go back far enough, we could argue that the window tax probably didn't make any sense. So people started bricking up their windows because you were taxed by how many windows you wanted. Yeah. The point you make, I think, is a good one. The government needs the money. They need to find ways to raise it.
Yes. Finally, another against point. Independent schools contribute quite a lot to the economy. So not just through fees, but through employment, local spending, charitable activities. So there's an argument the overall economic impact needs to be considered. And we also spoke about how if you do add VAT and they have to save some money, it could also result in job losses for certain people.
Well, we're short of teachers generally.
But it'll be even worse.
But we're short of teachers generally. So, I mean, it's not, again, comes back to funding. We've got schools merging and closing. But being a teacher I've always felt it's one of the few professions remaining where you do have a fairly strong confidence or good confidence that you won't be unemployed.
Yes.
You might not necessarily work in the context you want to work in. You might not necessarily work in the area you want to work in. But, ultimately, as we know, as a teacher, you can stick a sign up in a shop window and say you're a tutor. I'm not suggesting that that's the perfect career path. But what I'm saying is that I think there could be job losses because schools will shrink, classrooms will shrink. They will, but the one thing that really, look, I've watched school fees go from the level that I was paying when my children went to private school to the terrifying numbers that I'm hearing parents talk about now. And all of these schools have still got waiting lists.
Yeah.
So I'm tempted to wonder whether, whilst it would be uncomfortable or unpleasant, whether actually the impact that we're all concerned about, or people are
negligible.
Concerned about, will it? I mean, people are already finding money that I wouldn't have believed possible. Spare cash. And we're talking, let's put some numbers in it. I think, we're talking 8,000 a term or something for a local school.
It's 8.5.
8.5, so let's say 25,000 per child per year before all the rest. So you've got 2 kids, £50,000 in school fees.
Before you've put a jacket on their
Somebody's
back.
got to be earning £75,000 just to pay the school
Yep.
fees. Now, it's not a bad salary. £75,000 is an awful lot of money to earn before tax and give to a private school.
Yes.
Maybe there's another debate to be had here, because I think when we talk about private schools, unless you've had the experience of having children in a private school and knowing what it means to spend that sort of money, I think it's easy to either criticize them out of hand or to not see exactly how much money people are spending. And unless we look at those two things carefully, private schools, like all institutions, should be open to criticism. They shouldn't be beyond debate.
No.
But equally, nor should we sort of dismiss them as being only places where posh people go, because there are lots of people who come from all sorts of backgrounds who are sacrificing in order to raise that money.
Yes,
and send their kids
absolutely.
to school. So my point is for or against the idea of taxing them. I just want parents to start to look more carefully at the nature of the family finances and at how they could possibly use that to support their children. Because if they had to spend more time thinking about what school they were in, how they were being taught, how they were being tutored, then that would have a knock-on effect to the children. Because right now, when parents pay that sort of money, understandably, but very unhelpfully, they disengage from the process. Not all of them, clearly not all of them. For some people, it's like, I'm paying for this, I want to get the right result. But for some people, they think, well, that's, it's almost like, I've hired a gardener, I don't need to do the weeding. I've got a private school, I don't need to think about the children's education. And I think it's not a bad thing to have a debate that allows parents to look at what they're spending, think about how the children are being educated, and ask, is there a different way? This idea about would there be job losses, would it have an impact on the local area? I can't honestly see that most of these schools, I don't think they're going to disappear overnight. Now, they've had shocks like this before. So when national insurance contributions were changed, one of the big local schools here had their entire surplus of cash, because they're not allowed to make a profit because they're a charity, but they can hold a surplus. And when the national insurance contributions for teachers went up, their entire surplus was wiped out. They haven't got any smaller. So I think there's a certain amount of, these guys aren't, they're not some sort of, Fabergé egg that we shouldn't criticize, or, they need to be not touched, not looked at. I think they're much more robust than we think. And I think because they don't want their parents to have to pay an extra 20%, and of course parents don't want to have to pay an extra 20%, they will make arguments that, not exactly project fear, but they will kind of make these arguments that suggest that there's going to be some major social unrest or knock-on effect economically. I'm not so sure that's the case.
Well, we're only talking about, 600,000 children, something like that, that go to these schools. It's not a huge number, considering it's, I don't know how many millions there are in education generally. So over the next 10 years, they're predicting the schools will get smaller, or classrooms will get smaller, because the number of children going to school over the next 10 years is dropping by quite a big percentage because of the birth rate drops. But I think, going back to your point, maybe what it needs is that the independent schools need to make up their mind and not have a foot in each camp to say, well, we'll get business rate relief because we're a business, and we'll also take charity status, because you can't be both. It's one or the other, in my opinion.
Some parents go to the private system for different reasons than just like academic.
A lot of parents seem to go, from my experience having talked to parents, for the smaller class size.
That's one. So small, to go into a smaller school.
Yes.
Sometimes. And in some cases, with some of my friends that I knew at primary school, they left because of the bullying in the state school was so bad. So they ended up going for the Chigwell and other ones. So
I mean, it still happens there as well.
yeah,
I was just going to say, it still goes on in...
Yeah, but it's not really...
But you've got less students, you've got a bit more oversight, because obviously, but bullying is bullying. I mean, it's horrible.
It happens everywhere.
And it shouldn't be ignored. And what it does beg another question. Quite often private schools will not accept they have problems like bullying or like poor teaching or other potential, issues in and around the school fabric. And the reason they won't is because they are a business. And like any business, they want to present well to the public.
Best
They
face,
need a good sort of public image. All of their activity is based around the fact that selling themselves as if, look at any website, and they will show you the little children in the classroom and the big children leaving the sixth form. And wouldn't you like your child to be dressed in this cute little uniform and leaving through these gates, going on to the world to take? It's just not true. In the same way that, I don't know, Coke doesn't actually taste better than Pepsi, probably. But advertising for these schools is crucial. So quite often, issues like bullying get swept under the carpet. And so, yes, you might think to yourself, well, I'll send them to private school. There won't be a drug problem. There won't be a problem with violence. There won't be a problem with bullying. Well, unless the school hasn't got any children in whatsoever, there will be.
There will be.
It was nowhere near as... It wasn't anywhere near as bad. For say
Yes, I mean,
I think that's the thing, is it depends on the scale and the circumstances.
Yeah, less children, more space, more teachers generally means that there's better oversight. So, but it doesn't just disappear.
No,
it doesn't just disappear.
Is there a way of doing this in a palatable manner for parents and schools, so it's easy to...
You're always going to have the conflict, because nobody's going to want to pay, we already discussed this, put extra taxation in a very, very high taxation situation, an extra tax on anybody's income. Those to whom it will apply will be very upset. So I think in terms of there being a compromise, I think it's unlikely, because I can't see how you could compromise and say, well, 20% extra on your school fees, but we'll make sure they get an extra burger at lunchtime or something. There's no way.
We never got enough food.
No, exactly. But there's no way to give that money back in it. But because if you do, then you're not actually achieving what you set out to do.
So, go on.
But you could do a reduced rate. So as in,
like a
So,
tier, like a tier.
Yeah. So you
Tier
have
system.
like
Can you imagine the administration of
12.5
that?
or-
Can you imagine the administration of that would be way beyond the I mean, you'd spend a lot of your tax money just managing and administering that situation.
Well, I don't know, because some like energy bills and stuff are like 5%. Can you
No,
not
but-
just do like a
So
lower VAT?
So what you'd have to means test the parents and say, if you
Not the parents, the school.
No, yeah. You just do it as
So what you're saying is rather than use 20%, use 12% as a flat rate or 12.5% as a flat rate.
you could do it on a flat rate scheme and then
Or based on how
Like
much they earn.
construction has 5%
Right,
VAT,
but
don't they?
I'm sorry, I don't want to sort of wave my political credentials too hard here, but in a world where we were quite happy to put VAT on feminine hygiene products, are we really going to say that we should make some separate arrangement for private schools? I mean, this goes back to my original point about we have rules on taxation in this country. And I just think that this strikes me as the very wealthy and privileged whining about not being quite so wealthy and privileged. I'm not suggesting that's what's happening, but I can see how people would look at it in that way. So I think if we start compromising, it's going to, I mean, I think it would be political suicide for a start, but I think that would look bad.
I think ultimately places like Eton, Harrow, these big
Westminster.
ones, they'll actually do much better. So they'll make more money because they've got VAT. They'll put it up 20%, and then they'll basically subtract their VAT-able goods, and then
But any
better
company
position.
can do that.
Yes, but yeah, those ones will do fine. But then the ones that are smaller will just
Let's just go around. What would be your solutions? Or is there not any?
I don't believe there is a solution. I believe politically this is a very, very popular move amongst the country. I think because we're talking about a minority of parents here and a minority of schools, but it's a very vocal minority. And that's the issue here. You've got 7% of the children, so tiny percentage of families in the country, but these are the families who are likely to be on social media, writing to the press, making noise, and the schools themselves have got advocacy because of the people who went to these schools. So there will be a lot of people who can make a lot of noise around this issue. But I think I'm not suggesting every person in the country who's not a private school would agree, but I think it's unlikely you'll find many who won't.
So it's who shouts the loudest alongside some level of bias.
I think so, and I think also that for a lot of people, this is just a non-issue.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a regular middle-class family living in any part of the UK, sending your kids to the local state school and just getting on with life, you're probably thinking, really?
I'm not really bothered.
Given the world we're living in, given the
Well, they'd
issues,
probably say yes.
is this really? I mean, it will be an election issue because I think for Labour in particular, it's a vote winner.
Yes.
Because we are talking about the majority of people who don't benefit from this. I mean, we've just spent, I don't know, an hour and 20 minutes discussing this. And you could argue that the four of our collective intellects could have been put to better use today. I mean, I know it's our topic and that's fine, but you see what I mean? I mean, I think that actually it's politically very attractive. I think it goes down very, very well with the sort of areas that believe that they are being badly serviced when it comes to education. I think that's many parts of the country. So I don't think it's going to go away. I mean, I think the only way that there is a possible solution, and that would be for a Conservative win in the current election because they wouldn't do this. But I think, given the current state of play, I think it's not just a fait accompli. I think it's actually just the start.
Interestingly enough, though, there was like a lot of parents who send their children to private schools actually would have no problem paying VAT. Like, so they did a survey on this, and they actually came back with more people, the majority, saying they wouldn't stop them sending their
Goes
kids
back
there.
to Ian's point of, it's a storm in a teacup.
And some of them say as well that the societal benefit is more important than the sort of ways, because they feel they're in a privileged position.
I think
by
it's
sending
important to remember that not everybody not every family in that 7% who sends their children to private school are, by definition, leaning towards the right or voting Conservative. There are an awful lot of people, some of which are on the front bench of the Labour Party, who are using the private school system. Private schools attract a variety of families with different political and social backgrounds for a variety of reasons.
I think that's so. The conclusion is that essentially VAT on private schools is probably fair and palatable for the population politically, and thus is quite likely to go through if Labour win the election.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just one last point I would like to add is that when I was first training to be a teacher, one of my mentors made a very important point, which was in every lesson, what a teacher should aim to do is teach the student and the subject, not just the subject.
Not just the subject, absolutely.
And I think if we look at this debate about how we should fund schooling, I think we should start by making sure that we are aiming for the correct outcome, no matter what the context. Because if you've got a teacher who is teaching your son or daughter as a student, then they will have a better outcome, no matter what the context. Even if they have to pay for their own lunch, or they don't get to play the flute, or they don't get to go on cricket tours to, the and Dutch Antilles or whatever. You don't get all those other benefits. But if you have teachers who are willing to focus on the student as well as the subject, then that's a better place to start than worrying about whether private schools are going to have slightly more or slightly less students in.
And the sad thing about that is that there are so many teachers who want to do that, but the constraints of the systems stop them doing it because there's just not enough hours in the day.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can see, there's no clear conclusion to this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple, give us a follow and a rating, and we'll see you again next month.
The Education Lounge Podcast.